Look at any major city in the world. I mean, really look at it. Walk down the streets of New York, London, Paris, Moscow, or Buenos Aires. Notice something strange? The buildings have windows underground, not basements. Windows. Decorated, ornate windows with intricate stonework, sitting 5, 10, sometimes 15 feet below the current street level. Windows that open to dirt and darkness now, but were clearly designed to let in light and air. Why would anyone build windows underground? They wouldn't. That's the simple answer. No architect, no matter how incompetent, would design elaborate bay windows, carved stone frames, and decorative moldings for a basement. Yet there they are, in every old city on Earth, buried beneath the modern street level. The official explanation? The streets were raised over time. Trash and debris accumulated. Natural sediment buildup. But that explanation falls apart the moment you actually think about it. How does 15 feet of dirt spontaneously appear on top of a city in less than 200 years? How does an entire floor of every building in a metropolis get buried uniformly, all at once, across hundreds of square miles? How does this happen in cities on different continents, with different climates, different geological conditions, all during the same historical period? It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. But we're told to accept it anyway. We're told that somehow, mysteriously, every major city built before 1900 experienced identical mass burial events that covered the first floors of buildings designed to be above ground. We're told that people just kept living in these buildings, they just moved upstairs and forgot about it. We're told that photographs from the 1800s showing these buildings fully above ground are somehow misleading, that our eyes are lying to us. We're told a lot of things that don't hold up to 5 minutes of critical thinking. Let me show you what I mean. In Chicago, there are buildings from the 1880s, where the original ground floor is now a full story underground. Beautiful limestone facades with carved details, designed to be seen and admired, now buried in darkness. The current street level was supposedly raised after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. That's the official story. They raised the entire city by putting new streets on top of the old ones, except the fire was in 1871. Most of these buildings were constructed after the fire. They were built at what is now the underground level, then somehow ended up buried, within 10, maybe 15 years. Think about that timeline. Think about the logistics. You'd have to move millions of tons of earth. You'd have to coordinate the burial of hundreds of city blocks. You'd have to convince every building owner to sacrifice their ground floor. You'd have to maintain roads and infrastructure during this process. You'd need an army of workers, endless funding, and a reason that made sense. What reason could possibly justify burying an entire city? The official version gives you nothing, just vague explanations about sanitation and flooding. But here's what they don't tell you. The same phenomenon happened in Seattle, in New York, in London, in Paris, in Moscow, in Rome, in cities that never had a great fire, in cities built on hills where flooding makes no sense, in cities across every climate zone on Earth. All of them have buried first floors. All of them have windows underground. All of them have the same impossible explanation. What are the odds that every major city independently decided to bury their own streets at exactly the same point in history? What are the odds that they all used the same excuse? What are the odds that this global phenomenon has been completely normalized, accepted without question, treated as mundane rather than absolutely insane? Unless it wasn't a choice. Unless something happened that nobody wants to talk about. Walk into any old building in any old city and look at the doors. Really look at them. The main entrances are massive, 12 feet tall, sometimes 15. Thick wooden doors with ornate metal hardware built to withstand sieges. The door frames are carved from single pieces of stone. The thresholds are solid granite blocks weighing several tons. For what? Why would you need a door that big? Why would a normal residential building have an entrance designed for something twice the height of a human being? The standard explanation is that it's just architectural style. People in the past liked grand entrances. They built things larger to show wealth and status. But that doesn't explain the consistency. Every building, every city, the same proportions. And it's not just the main doors. The interior doorways are the same. 10, 12 feet high. Hallways wide enough to drive a car through. Ceilings so high that modern buildings seem like dollhouses in comparison. These buildings were designed for something bigger than us. Look at the staircases. The steps are wrong. Each one is too tall, too deep. You have to adjust your gait to climb them properly. Your modern body doesn't fit the geometry. And yet these staircases exist in buildings we're told were designed for normal people just like us, only 150 years ago. Did humans shrink since 1850? Did our legs get shorter? Or were these buildings designed by someone else, for someone else, and we simply moved in later? Consider the windows for a moment. Not just the underground ones, but all of them. In old buildings, windows are enormous, 20 feet tall in some cases. Single panes of glass that would be impossible to manufacture with 19th century technology. Curved glass. Perfectly clear glass without the bubbles and imperfections that should exist in hand-blown panes. Glass so large and so perfect that modern manufacturers struggle to replicate it. How did they make this glass in 1850? How did they transport it without breaking? How did they install it without cranes? They couldn't have. Not with the technology we're told they had. Not with horses and wooden scaffolding. Not without modern engineering. But the windows are there. The glass is there. Perfectly fitted into frames carved from single pieces of stone, held in place by techniques we can't reproduce today. You see the pattern emerging? Every detail of these buildings contradicts the official timeline. Every element suggests capabilities far beyond what we're told existed. And when you point this out, when you ask reasonable questions about physics and logistics, you're dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. You're told to trust the experts. You're told that your own eyes are wrong. But your eyes aren't wrong. These buildings weren't built by the people we're told built them. They couldn't have been. The math doesn't work. The physics doesn't work. The timeline doesn't work. What makes far more sense, what actually aligns with the physical evidence, is that these structures were already here. Ancient, built by a civilization with capabilities we can't match today. And at some point, relatively recently, new inhabitants moved in. Think about it like this. Imagine a primitive tribe discovering a modern skyscraper. The building still stands, mostly intact, but abandoned. The tribe moves in. They don't understand the electrical systems, so they gut them. They don't understand the plumbing, so they modify it with crude pipes. They don't understand the HVAC, so they build fireplaces. They don't understand the elevators, so they seal the shafts. They're living in a technological marvel they can't comprehend. They make up stories about how their ancestors built it with simple tools and determination. They point to the modifications they've made as proof of their own capabilities. But the building itself, the core structure, the engineering genius behind it, that wasn't them. They're just the current occupants. That's us. That's humanity right now. We're the tribe living in the skyscraper, claiming we built it, modifying it to suit our limited understanding, forgetting that someone far more advanced came before. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. In St. Petersburg, there are buildings with 2 ground floors. One at the current street level, and another one buried beneath it. Both have main entrances. Both have the same architectural features. The buried one is older, more ornate, more sophisticated in its engineering. The one above ground is cruder, simpler, built like an addition rather than original construction. The pattern repeats in Moscow, in Kiev, in Warsaw. Multiple ground floors, one on top of another, showing clear degradation in quality from bottom to top. The older levels, now underground, display mastery. The newer levels, at current street height, display imitation, like children trying to copy something they don't fully understand. In Paris, the catacombs aren't natural caves. They're the buried levels of the original city. Miles of tunnels that were once streets and buildings, now rebranded as ancient quarries or burial sites to explain away their existence. But walk through them, and you see the truth. These were functioning spaces. There are drainage systems, there are ventilation shafts, there are architectural details that make no sense for a mine or a tomb. These were living spaces, part of a city that got buried. The same story in Rome, the same story in London, the same story everywhere you look. Old cities have underground sections that official history can't adequately explain. They tell you these are just basements, just foundations, just forgotten storage areas. But the engineering says otherwise. The scale says otherwise. The consistency across the globe says otherwise. Something happened, something massive, something that buried the old world and forced the survivors to build on top of the ruins. And here's where it gets disturbing. Look at old photographs from the 1800s. Look at pictures of major cities from 1850, 1860, 1870. Do you notice what's missing? People. The streets are empty. These photographs show grand buildings, elaborate infrastructure, paved roads, but almost no human presence. Where you do see people, they're sparse, scattered, like they've just moved into an abandoned city. The buildings are clearly old, clearly weathered, but the official dates say they were just constructed. Brand new architecture that already looks ancient. How does that work? How do you build a cathedral in 1850 that already appears to have stood for centuries? How do you construct entire city blocks that show immediate signs of age and decay? You don't. You move into buildings that are already old. You occupy spaces that were already there. And then you create a historical narrative that credits your recent arrival with ancient construction. Check the population records. In city after city across Europe and America, the population data from the early 1800s makes no sense. Official histories claim these cities had been continuously occupied for centuries, growing slowly and steadily. But the census data tells a different story. Sudden population explosions, cities going from a few thousand people to hundreds of thousands in the span of a single decade, not through natural growth, not through normal immigration, through repopulation. New people moving into old spaces. And where did the original inhabitants go? What happened to the builders of these magnificent structures? The official history is silent on this. It pretends the question doesn't exist. It fills the gap with generic stories about plagues and wars and migrations, but never addresses the central mystery. If these cities were continuously occupied by the same civilization that built them, why is there such a clear break in architectural quality? Why does construction technique suddenly degrade in the late 1700s and early 1800s? Why do we lose the ability to create the very things we supposedly just created? Master craftsmen don't forget their skills in a single generation. Architectural knowledge doesn't vanish overnight, unless there's a discontinuity. Unless the builders disappear and are replaced by people who can only imitate, never recreate. The buildings themselves tell this story. Look at any structure from the alleged 1700s or early 1800s. The lower portions, often now underground, show incredible mastery, perfect stonework, sophisticated engineering, advanced understanding of physics and materials. Then you look at additions made later in the same century. The quality drops dramatically. The stones don't fit as well. The designs are simpler. The engineering is cruder. It's not a gradual decline, it's a cliff. One generation builds masterpieces. The next generation barely manages competent copies. And we're supposed to believe this is normal? We're supposed to accept that human capability just randomly collapsed across the entire planet at the same moment in history? Or is the simpler explanation that the later builders weren't the same people at all? Consider the heating systems in old buildings. Before modern central heating, how did massive stone structures stay warm in winter? The official answer is fireplaces. But do the math. A building with 50 rooms would need 50 fireplaces, 50 chimneys, constant fire maintenance, endless wood consumption. The logistics don't work. The heat distribution doesn't work. Stone conducts cold. You can't heat a granite palace with fireplaces. Yet these buildings exist in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in cities where winter temperatures drop to -30 degrees, and the buildings are comfortable. Even today, with minimal modern heating, these structures maintain reasonable temperatures. How? Look at the architecture more carefully. There are air shafts throughout these buildings, elaborate ductwork hidden in the walls, channels and passages that don't match any known heating system from the 1800s. Official historians call them ventilation, but that doesn't explain the complexity. That doesn't explain why they're designed to circulate air in specific patterns. That doesn't explain the metallic components still visible in some shafts, components made from alloys we can't identify. These buildings had heating systems we no longer understand. Advanced systems. Technology that was removed or destroyed, leaving only the empty channels behind. And the new inhabitants, unable to comprehend what they found, installed crude fireplaces and told themselves they'd figured out heating on their own. The same pattern appears with water systems. Old buildings have plumbing that predates modern plumbing. Complex pipe networks made from materials that shouldn't exist in pre-industrial construction. Lead pipes that show no corrosion, despite being allegedly 200 years old. Ceramic pipes with glazing techniques we can't reproduce. Stone channels carved with precision that requires modern tools, and water pressure. How did they achieve water pressure in tall buildings without electric pumps? The official answer involves rooftop tanks and gravity, but the math doesn't work for buildings 6, 8, 10 stories high. The pressure needed to push water up that far, then distribute it throughout the building, requires more than simple gravity. It requires pumping systems, mechanical or pneumatic systems that shouldn't have existed in 1850. But the plumbing works. It worked then. It works now. Which means the systems existed, regardless of what the official timeline allows. Let me show you something else. Something most people never notice because it's too big, too obvious. The street layouts in old cities don't make sense. They're not designed for horses and carriages. The roads are too wide. The intersections are too complex. The traffic patterns are optimized for something else. Look at Paris. The boulevards are enormous, hundreds of feet wide. Why? The official story says it was for military purposes, to prevent barricades during revolutions. But that's nonsense. Most of these streets predate the revolutions they supposedly prevented. And the width isn't just about space, it's about geometry. The angles are wrong for horse-drawn vehicles. The curves are wrong. The grade changes are wrong. These streets were designed for different transportation, something faster, something that needed specific turning radii and sight lines, something that could handle the peculiar geometry of these roads in ways that horses and carriages never could. The same phenomenon appears in city after city. Wide boulevards, strange angles, intersections that create traffic problems for modern cars, but would make perfect sense for something else. We inherited infrastructure designed for technology we don't have. And rather than admit that, we pretend it was always meant for us. Even the materials don't make sense. The stones used in old construction aren't local. In New York, buildings from the 1800s use granite from quarries that are thousands of miles away. Massive blocks, weighing dozens of tons, supposedly transported by ship and horse-drawn cart. The logistics are insane. The cost would be prohibitive. Why not use local stone? Unless the buildings were already there. Unless they were built when different transportation existed. Unless our ancestors simply found these structures and claimed them. The same issue with the mortar. Chemical analysis of mortar from old buildings shows compositions that don't match historical records. There are compounds that shouldn't be there. Binding agents that weren't invented until the 20th century. Additives that give the mortar properties beyond what period technology could produce. Standard explanation? We must be mistaken about the dates. Or the builders had secret techniques passed down through guilds. Or maybe the analysis is wrong. Any excuse to avoid the obvious conclusion. The mortar is advanced because the buildings are older than we think. The transportation isn't problematic because the buildings weren't transported. They were already there. Everything we're told about construction dates is wrong, not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, completely wrong. Now let's talk about something that should terrify you: the World Fairs. Those massive exhibitions held in the late 1800s and early 1900s across America and Europe. Chicago, 1893. Paris, 1889 and 1900. St. Louis, 1904. San Francisco, 1915. Dozens of others. The official story says these fairs were temporary. Elaborate exhibitions built in months, used for a few weeks, then demolished. Entire cities within cities, featuring hundreds of ornate buildings, constructed from plaster and wood frames, then destroyed after the fair ended. That's what we're told. Look at the photographs. These weren't temporary structures. They were architectural masterpieces. Massive domed buildings. Classical columns hundreds of feet high. Intricate facades, sculptures, fountains. Infrastructure that would take years to design and build, supposedly erected in 18 months by small crews with primitive tools. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the White City, covered 600 acres, over 200 buildings. Classical architecture on a scale that rivaled ancient Rome. Official history says it was all temporary, all plaster and staff material over wooden frames. Then they burned it all down when the fair ended. But here's what doesn't make sense. Why build something so elaborate just to destroy it? Why invest millions of dollars in construction only to demolish it months later? Why create infrastructure, power systems, water systems, transportation networks for a temporary event? And the timeline. The fair was announced in 1890. Construction supposedly began in 1891. That gives 2 years to design and build 600 acres of classical architecture. 2 years for what should take decades. How? With what workforce? Using what construction methods? The photographs from the construction phase show something interesting. The buildings don't look like they're being built. They look like they're being cleaned. Workers on scaffolding appear to be removing dirt and debris, not adding material. The structures look old, weathered, like they've been there for years, and teams are simply restoring them for the fair. What if that's exactly what happened? What if these fairs weren't construction projects at all, but revelation projects? What if organizers simply uncovered existing architecture, cleaned it up, used it for a few months, then buried or destroyed it again? That would explain the impossible timeline. It would explain the architectural sophistication. It would explain why these temporary buildings looked more advanced than permanent structures being built at the same time. They weren't new. They were old, ancient, perhaps. Remnants of the previous civilization, briefly exposed, then eliminated. And after each fair, fires. Convenient, devastating fires that destroyed most of the evidence. The Chicago World's Fair burned. The San Francisco Fair burned. Components of the Paris expositions burned. Over and over, these magnificent structures succumbed to mysterious fires that left little behind. Accidents, every single time, or deliberate destruction of evidence. Look at what happened after the fairs. The sites were completely cleared, not just demolished, but excavated. Dirt was brought in. The areas were regraded. Every trace of the original structures was eliminated, buried under new layers of earth. Then new construction began on top, modern buildings replacing what had been there before. The same pattern as the buried first floors. The same pattern as the underground cities. Build on top of the old. Bury the evidence. Create a new narrative. And who attended these fairs? Millions of people saw these buildings. Millions of people walked through classical architecture that rivaled anything in ancient Rome. What did they think? Did they question how temporary structures could be so magnificent? Did they wonder why buildings scheduled for demolition were built with such permanence? The newspapers from the time period are revealing. There are accounts of visitors expressing shock and confusion, people questioning the official narrative, articles suggesting that some of the buildings must have been there before the fair. But these voices were drowned out. The official story was pushed relentlessly. Temporary exhibition, plaster and wood, impressive but impermanent. And then it burned. And then it was buried. And the questions stopped. Consider the technology on display at these fairs. Electric lighting on a massive scale, decades before widespread electrical infrastructure, advanced water features and fountains, transportation systems within the fairgrounds that surpassed city systems. All of this supposedly designed and built for temporary exhibitions. The electrical systems are particularly interesting. The Chicago World's Fair featured extensive electric lighting powered by massive generators. But here's the issue. The power requirements don't match the stated generator capacity. The buildings were too large, the lights too numerous. The official power sources couldn't have supplied enough electricity. Unless there were other power sources. Hidden systems. Infrastructure that was already in place. Part of the original buildings, simply reactivated for the fair. That would explain the discrepancy. That would explain how they achieved electrical effects that engineers of the time said were impossible. And after the fair, this technology disappeared. No widespread adoption, no commercial development. The advanced electrical systems vanished as thoroughly as the buildings themselves. Almost like they were never ours to begin with. Just borrowed briefly from structures we didn't build. The same pattern appears with the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were transported from East Coast cities to the American Midwest and West. Official history calls this a charitable relocation program. Orphanages were overcrowded, so children were sent to rural families who needed labor. But the numbers don't make sense. 200,000 orphans? Where did they all come from? Even accounting for disease and poverty, how do you generate that many orphaned children in cities that supposedly had stable populations? And the descriptions of these children. Many were reported as well-dressed, well-educated, speaking languages other than English. They didn't match the profile of street urchins from overcrowded orphanages. They seemed like children from educated middle-class families who had suddenly lost their parents. Mass orphaning on that scale suggests catastrophe. Not slow poverty or disease, but sudden, devastating loss of adult population. Something that killed parents but left children alive. Something that emptied cities of their original inhabitants but left the infrastructure intact. The orphan trains coincide with the repopulation period, the same decades when city populations mysteriously exploded, when new people appeared in old cities, when architectural quality degraded, when buried first floors and underground chambers became normalized. What if the orphan trains weren't charity? What if they were redistribution? Children of the previous civilization, the actual builders, being dispersed and assimilated into new population groups. Their history erased. Their origin obscured. Their knowledge of the old world deliberately destroyed through separation and re-education. The timeline fits, the geography fits, the scale fits, and it explains something that official history can't. Why would you need to transport 200,000 children across a continent unless there was a massive demographic disruption that required population redistribution? Look at the photographs of these children. They don't look like street orphans. They look lost, confused, displaced. Like they came from somewhere else and don't understand where they are now. Exactly what you'd expect from children who survived a civilization collapse. Now connect this to the mud flood evidence. In cities around the world, there's a layer of mud and sediment that appears in the archaeological record at roughly the same time period, late 1700s to mid-1800s. A global layer of destruction and burial. Official archaeology dismisses this. They claim it's normal sediment accumulation, or localized flooding events, or construction fill brought in during urban development. But the layer is too consistent, too uniform, too widespread to be coincidence. And it's not just mud. There are ash deposits, burn layers, evidence of massive fires followed by burial. The pattern repeats across continents, across climate zones, in cities that shouldn't share geological events. Something happened globally. A catastrophe that left a physical mark in the earth. And rather than investigate, rather than acknowledge the evidence, official science pretends it's nothing. Normal urban development, nothing to see here. But people saw. Contemporary accounts from the 1800s describe strange weather, years without summer, crop failures, unexplained darkness, atmospheric disturbances that don't fit normal patterns. These reports cluster around the same period as the mud layers, the same period as the population disruptions, the same period as the architectural discontinuity. Cause and effect. Something happened to the atmosphere, something that caused flooding, or mud deposition, or burial on a global scale, something that killed or displaced massive populations, something that left cities empty and ready for new inhabitants. And then those new inhabitants rewrote history. They claimed the buildings. They created narratives about construction and development. They buried the evidence, literally and figuratively, and told everyone that the world had always been this way. The technology of the old world was systematically destroyed or hidden, not because it didn't work, because it worked too well, because it represented a level of advancement that the new civilization couldn't match or control. Look at what happened to free energy research. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, inventors were exploring atmospheric electricity. Nikola Tesla demonstrated wireless power transmission. Others experimented with earth batteries and environmental energy collection. The technology showed promise, real, measurable results. Then it stopped. Funding disappeared. Research was suppressed. Patents were classified or bought up and buried. Within a few decades, the entire field vanished from mainstream science. We were told it was pseudoscience, impossible, not worth investigating. But what if it wasn't new technology at all? What if inventors like Tesla were rediscovering old systems? What if the infrastructure for atmospheric power collection already existed in these ancient buildings, and people were just figuring out how it worked? That would explain the suppression. You can't control free energy. You can't meter it. You can't build an economy around something anyone can access. So you destroy it. You classify the research. You discredit the inventors. You make sure the technology stays buried with the buildings that once used it. The decorative elements on old buildings aren't decorative. They're functional. Those spires and towers and metal fixtures on rooftops aren't ornamental. They're antennas, collection points for atmospheric electricity. The buildings themselves were power receivers, part of a global energy grid that we dismantled and forgot. Look at the architecture, metallic domes, copper roofing, specific geometric patterns. These aren't random design choices. They're engineering decisions. Every element serves a purpose in collecting and distributing energy. And we gutted it all. We removed the functional components and told ourselves we were just updating old buildings. The same with the water systems. Old fountains and water features weren't just aesthetic. They were part of cooling and power distribution systems. Moving water for thermal management. Specific flow patterns for energy transfer. Technology we no longer understand, so we treat it as decoration. We live among the machinery of a dead civilization and we don't even recognize it. We've turned power stations into museums. We've converted functional architecture into tourist attractions. We walk through the remains of advanced technology and call it primitive. The evidence of deliberate destruction is everywhere. The great fires of the 1800s weren't accidents. Chicago, 1871. London, 1666. San Francisco, 1906. Moscow, 1812. Rome, 64 AD, if you believe that dating. Major cities burned at convenient points in history, destroying records and evidence. And what burned? Libraries, archives, government buildings, the repositories of knowledge. While residential areas often survived, the places where historical records were kept burned completely, over and over, in city after city. Coincidence? Or systematic erasure? After each fire, reconstruction. New buildings on old foundations. New histories written to replace destroyed records. The narrative shifts slightly with each burning. Details change. Dates get adjusted. The story of who built what and when becomes more controlled, more aligned with the official version. Look at the Vatican archives. Millions of documents, most sealed from public view. Why? What could be so dangerous about historical records that they need to be hidden for centuries? What truth could those documents contain that threatens the established narrative? or the Library of Congress. Massive collections of old maps, documents, records that aren't available for public research. Classified, restricted, labeled too fragile for access. But really, every single document, or just the ones that contradict official history, the control of information is total. What we know about the past comes filtered through institutions that have vested interests in maintaining specific narratives. We don't have direct access to primary sources. We get interpretations, summaries, approved versions of history. And when someone does find contradictory evidence, when documents surface that don't fit the official story, they're explained away. Forgeries, misinterpretations, anomalies. The gatekeepers of history dismiss anything that threatens the accepted timeline. But the physical evidence can't be dismissed so easily. The buildings remain, the buried floors remain, the impossible construction remains. You can burn libraries, but you can't hide cities. You can destroy documents, but you can't erase architecture that millions of people see every day. That's why the psychological conditioning is so important. That's why we're taught from childhood to accept the official explanation without question. That's why asking basic logical questions about construction timelines or population data gets you labeled a conspiracy theorist. The truth is too destabilizing. If people realize that our entire historical narrative is wrong, that we didn't build the cities we live in, that we're inhabiting the ruins of a more advanced civilization, everything changes. Power structures collapse. Authority becomes questionable. The whole foundation of modern society comes under scrutiny. So we're given explanations that don't make sense and told to accept them. We're shown evidence of impossibility and told to ignore it. We're surrounded by mysteries and told they're not mysterious at all. Just normal urban development. Just architectural fashion. Just coincidence that the same phenomena appear worldwide. Nothing to investigate. Nothing to question. Move along. But some people don't move along. Some people look at the buried windows and ask why. Some people examine the construction timelines and see the contradictions. Some people notice that the official story requires more faith than the alternative explanation. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you notice the first buried floor, you start seeing them everywhere. Once you question one impossible construction claim, you question them all. The entire facade of official history starts crumbling. We are not the builders. We are the inheritors. We live in structures we didn't create, using technology we don't fully understand, telling ourselves stories about our own greatness that fall apart under examination. The ancient world wasn't primitive. We are. We're the primitive ones, struggling to maintain infrastructure we can't recreate, living among ruins we claim as our own achievement, forgetting that human civilization once reached heights we can't imagine. Something destroyed that civilization. Something buried their cities and scattered their people. Something erased their history so thoroughly that we don't even remember they existed. And something installed us as the new occupants, gave us a false history, and made sure we'd never question it. But the evidence remains. In every city, in every old building, in every buried floor and oversized door and impossible construction detail. The truth is written in stone, literally, for anyone willing to look. We are living among the ruins of a world far greater than ours. We are not the peak of human achievement. We are the survivors of a collapse, the descendants of people who forgot how to build what their ancestors created. We are the new tenants in an ancient building, and we've convinced ourselves that we're the architects. The question isn't whether this is true. The evidence makes it undeniable. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we keep pretending? Do we keep accepting impossible explanations? Do we keep letting authorities tell us that our eyes are lying? Or do we start demanding real answers? Do we start investigating the physical evidence without prejudice? Do we start questioning who benefits from keeping us ignorant about our own past? Because someone does benefit. Someone gains from our ignorance. Someone wants us to believe we're the pinnacle of human development, that everything before us was primitive, that we have nothing to learn from buried cities and forgotten technology. But we do have something to learn. We have everything to learn. The old world knew things we've forgotten. They built things we can't replicate. They achieved what we call impossible. And their knowledge isn't gone. It's just buried, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to remember how to see it.
The buildings are trying to tell us their story. The architecture is speaking a language we've forgotten. The cities themselves are evidence of what we lost. All we have to do is listen. All we have to do is look at what's actually there instead of what we're told should be there. And when we do, when we really see it, we'll understand. We're not alone in this world. We never have been.
We're walking through the ruins of giants, living in their houses, using their roads, and pretending we built it all ourselves. The truth is written in every buried window, in every oversized door, in every impossible construction detail. We are the inheritors of a forgotten world. We are the children of catastrophe. We are living proof that civilization can rise, fall, and forget itself completely. And if it happened before, it can happen again. That's the real terror. Not that we didn't build these cities, but that we could lose them just as thoroughly as the previous civilization did. We could vanish. Our cities could be buried. New inhabitants could move in and claim our achievements as their own. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And the echo we're hearing now, the evidence all around us, is telling us something vital about our past and our future. We just have to be brave enough to listen. The ancient Tartarian buildings were meant to be above ground. They were designed for light and air and human habitation at street level. But something buried them. Something covered the old world and forced new occupants to build on top. And until we understand what that something was, until we acknowledge that it happened, we're vulnerable to the same fate. The buildings remember. The earth remembers. The physical evidence remembers. Only we have forgotten. And that forgetting might be the most dangerous thing of all.